What if the story you've heard your entire life begins in the wrong place? What if the first page isn't the beginning, but a carefully placed curtain hiding something far older, something buried so deep that most people never even realize it's there? Because the moment you open Genesis, you think you're reading a single story, a clean beginning, a straight line from nothing to everything. But almost immediately, the ground beneath that assumption begins to crack, because Genesis does something strange, something unsettling, something that feels almost like a whisper hidden in plain sight. It tells the story of creation twice, and not in the way you'd expect. Not like a repetition for emphasis, but like two different voices describing reality from two different angles. And if you're not paying attention, you miss it, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. The first account unfolds like thunder across the cosmos, vast, powerful, almost overwhelming in its scale. A voice speaks, and reality obeys. Light bursts into existence. The sky stretches out. The seas gather. The land rises. Life multiplies. And then comes the moment that defines everything. Let us make mankind in our image. Not a single man, not a name, but mankind, plural, collective, male and female together, created at once, blessed, commanded to fill the earth, to rule, to multiply, to spread across the world like a living reflection of the divine. And the name used here matters, because this God is called Elohim, a name that carries weight, authority, distance, majesty. This is not a God walking among people. This is a God who commands galaxies into existence with a word, a God whose voice echoes through the void and shapes reality itself. And in this first telling, humanity is not small, not isolated, not confined. It is vast, spread, already plural, already many. But then something happens that feels almost like the camera suddenly zooming in. The tone shifts, the scale shrinks, the voice changes, and without warning, we're no longer watching the birth of the universe. We are standing in a quiet place, a specific place, and instead of voice speaking worlds into existence, we see hands forming, shaping, touching the dust of the ground. And suddenly the story is no longer about mankind. It is about a man, one man, unnamed at first, formed carefully, personally, intimately. And the God here is no longer just Elohim. Now the text calls him Yahweh Elohim, a name that feels closer, more personal, a God who doesn't just create from afar, but leans down into the dust, breathes into nostrils, gives life directly. And that shift is not small. It is everything. Because now the question begins to form, quietly at first, but impossible to ignore once it takes shape. Why are there two creation stories? Why does one describe humanity as already existing, male and female together, spread across the earth, while the other isolates a single man, forms him alone, places him somewhere, specific in a garden, in a place that feels less like wilderness and more like a sacred space, almost like a temple? And if you try to force these two stories into one simple timeline, they resist, they don't quite fit. The order feels different, the focus feels different, the purpose feels different. And for centuries, people have tried to smooth it out, to explain it away, to say it's just repetition, just style, just another way of telling the same thing. But what if that's not what's happening at all? What if instead of contradiction, this is layering? What if Genesis is not giving you one flat story, but two dimensions of the same reality, one wide, one narrow, one cosmic, one personal, one about humanity as a whole, and one about a single man chosen from within that humanity? Because think about it, in the first account, humans are already created, already blessed, already told to fill the earth. But in the second account, the man is alone, placed into a garden, given a task, given a boundary, given a role that feels very different from simply existing. This is not just life, this is assignment, this is responsibility. This is something closer to calling than creation. And that's where the idea begins to shift in a way that changes everything. Because maybe the question isn't, was Adam the first human? Maybe the real question is, what was Adam chosen for? Because the text never explicitly says he is the first biological human in the same way we assume. It simply introduces him as the man formed, the man placed, the man given a task, the man named, and naming matters. Because in ancient texts, To be named is to be chosen, to be singled out, to be set apart from the unnamed background. And suddenly, the possibility opens up like a door you didn't even know was there. What if Genesis 1 describes humanity as a whole, the spread of human beings across the earth, while Genesis 2 zooms in on one man, selected from that already existing humanity, placed into a sacred space, given a role that no one else has, not because he is the first to exist, but because he is the first to be chosen. And if that's true, then the story you thought you knew begins to shift in a way that is both subtle and explosive, because now Adam is not just the beginning of humanity, he is the beginning of something else entirely, something more specific, something more dangerous, something more focused. He is the beginning of covenant, the beginning of a relationship between God and man that is not about existence, but about purpose, about responsibility, about obedience, about something sacred that is about to unfold inside a place that feels less like a garden and more like a sanctuary. And if Adam is the chosen one, not the first one, then the question that follows is impossible to avoid because it rises quietly at first, but once it forms, it refuses to go away. If he was chosen from among many, then who were the others who existed outside that garden, beyond its boundaries, beyond its story, living, breathing, unseen, unspoken, but perhaps always there just outside the frame? And that question is where everything begins to change. And once that question enters your mind, it doesn't leave, it lingers, it grows, because if Adam is not simply the first man, but the chosen man, then everything about his existence starts to feel different, heavier, more intentional. And the garden he's placed in no longer looks like a peaceful paradise meant for comfort. It starts to look like something structured, something sacred, something designed with purpose. Because Genesis tells us he was placed there to work it and to keep it. And on the surface, that sounds simple, almost ordinary, like farming, like survival, like the beginning of agriculture. But the deeper you look, the more those words begin to shift under your feet. Because in the original language, those words are not ordinary at all. The word for work is avid. And it doesn't just mean to cultivate soil. It means to serve, to minister, even to worship. And the word for keep is shamar, which means to guard, to protect, to preserve something sacred. And those two words together are not random. They appear again later in Scripture, not in fields or farms, but in temples, describing the duties of priests, the ones who stand between God and sacred space, the ones who serve and guard what is holy. Suddenly Adam is no longer just a man in a garden. He is something else entirely, something far more specific. He is the first priest placed not in a random location, but in what now begins to look like the first temple, the first place where heaven and earth meet, the first sacred space where the presence of God is not distant but near, walking, breathing, present. And Adam's role is not just to live there, but to maintain it, to protect it, to serve within it, to guard its holiness. And that changes everything, because now the story is no longer about where humanity began. It's about what humanity was meant to do. And Adam becomes the prototype, not of biology, but of responsibility, of calling, of covenant. Because a priest does not exist for himself. A priest exists as a bridge, as a mediator, someone who stands between two worlds. And if Adam is that figure, then his role was never small. It was cosmic. His obedience would mean harmony. His failure would mean collapse. And suddenly the presence of the two trees in the garden takes on a completely different meaning, because they are not just plants. They are boundaries, sacred boundaries. The tree of life representing divine presence, eternal connection, and the tree of knowledge representing something forbidden, something not meant to be grasped, something that defines the line between trust and rebellion. And Adam's role as priest is to respect that boundary, to live within it, to guard it, not just physically, but spiritually. Because a priest doesn't just tend space, he protects order, and that means keeping out anything that would corrupt it, anything that would break the harmony between God and creation. And that's where the tension in the story begins to build. Because if Adam was placed there to guard, then the moment something enters that shouldn't be there, the responsibility falls on him. And then the serpent appears, not introduced with explanation, not given an origin, just suddenly there, inside the space Adam was meant to protect, speaking, questioning, twisting, and in that moment something crucial happens, something most people overlook. Adam does nothing. He doesn't guard. He doesn't resist. He doesn't remove the threat. He listens, or at least he allows it to unfold. And that silence, that inaction is not small. It is the beginning of everything unraveling. Because if Adam is a priest, then his failure is not just disobedience. It is a collapse of duty, a failure to protect sacred space, a failure to uphold covenant. And when the boundary is crossed, when the fruit is taken, it is not just a rule being broken. It is a sanctuary being defiled, a holy place losing its holiness. And the consequences are immediate, not just shame, not just fear, but separation. And that's when the story shifts again, because the garden that once felt open, safe, connected, suddenly becomes closed, guarded, unreachable. And the presence of God that once walked freely now becomes something distant, something that cannot be approached the same way anymore. And exile begins, not just physical exile, but spiritual exile, the breaking of something that was never meant to break. But here's where it gets even more unsettling. Because if Adam's role was to represent humanity, to stand as the priest, then his failure doesn't stay with him. It spreads, not like a disease in the body, but like a fracture in reality itself. Because a broken bridge doesn't just affect itself, it affects everything connected to it. And yet, even as the story moves forward, even as Adam and Eve leave the garden, something strange lingers beneath the surface, something unresolved. Because if this was the center, the sacred space, the chosen place, then what lies outside it begins to matter more than ever. Because outside the garden is where the story goes next. Outside the garden is where humanity continues. Outside the garden is where something unexpected begins to appear. Because the moment we leave Eden, the world doesn't feel empty, it feels inhabited. And that's where the next part of the mystery begins to rise. Slowly, quietly, but with a force that cannot be ignored, because the story of the next generation, the story of Cain, is about to reveal something that doesn't fit, something that shouldn't be there if Adam and Eve were truly alone, something that cracks the surface wide open, because Cain is afraid of someone. And the question is, who? And this is where the story stops being comfortable. Because up until now, you can still hold on to the idea that everything is contained, that the world is small, that it's just Adam, Eve, and their children slowly building humanity from nothing. But the moment Cain speaks, that illusion begins to collapse. Because after the first murder in human history, after Abel falls and his blood cries out from the ground, Cain is not just punished, he is exiled, marked, sent away, and what he says next should stop you cold if you're really listening. My punishment is more than I can bear. Whoever finds me will kill me. Whoever finds him. Not his parents, not some future children, but whoever, as if there are already others out there, others he expects to encounter, others he fears, others capable of violence. And suddenly the story doesn't feel like the beginning of humanity anymore. It feels like a small piece of a much larger world we're never told about. Because think about it carefully at this point in the narrative. The text has only introduced Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel. And Abel is already dead, so logically, there should be no one else, no strangers, no hidden tribes, no unknown people wandering the earth. And yet Cain speaks as if the world is already populated, as if stepping outside his immediate family means stepping into danger, into contact with people who are not part of his story. And God's response makes it even more unsettling, because instead of correcting him, instead of saying there is no one else, God places a mark on Cain to protect him from being killed by others who apparently exist, others who might harm him, others who are real enough to require divine protection. And just like that, the text quietly confirms what it never openly explains. There are others, and the story doesn't pause to explain them. It doesn't introduce them. It doesn't tell you where they came from. It simply moves forward as if they've always been there, as if you were supposed to notice, or maybe as if you weren't. And then it goes further, because Cain leaves, he goes east of Eden, into the land of Nod, a name that literally means wandering, restlessness, exile. But when he arrives there, he does something that should be impossible if the world is still emptied. He finds a wife explanation. no introduction, no genealogy, just a wife, a person who exists independently of the small family we've been following. And again, the text doesn't slow down, it doesn't clarify, it just continues, as if this detail is normal, as if the existence of other people is already assumed. And then comes the detail that completely breaks the small world model apart. Cain builds a city. Not a shelter, not a camp, not a single home, but a city, something that requires population, structure, community, multiple families, multiple lives intersecting, because a city cannot exist for one man and his wife. It requires people, many people, enough to fill streets, enough to create society, enough to form something larger than a single lineage that is, oh, now the question is no longer subtle, that it becomes unavoidable. Where did these people come from? Because the traditional explanation tries to solve it by saying Adam and Eve had many children not yet mentioned, that Cain's wife was one of his sisters, that humanity expanded quickly, that the text simply skips details, and while that explanation is possible, it doesn't fully resolve the tension because Cain's fear comes before any large population is described. His awareness of others seems immediate, instinctive, not something that develops over generations. And the text itself never says, these are your siblings or these are descendants of Adam. It remains silent, and that silence is not empty. It's loaded. It leaves space for something else, something bigger, something that connects back to the very beginning, back to those two creation accounts that didn't quite line up. Because if Genesis 1 describes humanity as a whole, already created, already spread across the earth, and Genesis 2 focuses on Adam as the chosen man placed in a specific sacred space, then suddenly everything starts to fit in a way that is both simple and shocking. The others were always there, outside the garden, beyond Eden's boundaries, living their lives, forming communities, existing as humanity in its broad sense, while Adam and Eve's story unfolds separately, not as the origin of all humans, but as the origin of something else, something more focused, more intentional, something tied to covenant. And Cain's exile is not the beginning of civilization. It is his entry into it, that he doesn't create humanity. He joins it, that he steps out of the sacred story and into the wider human world, a world that has been running parallel all along, unseen but present, hidden but real. And that changes the way you see everything that comes after, because now the Bible's focus feels different. It's not trying to map every human being, that it's tracing a line, that a specific line, that a chosen line. From Adam to Seth, from Seth to Noah, from Noah to Abraham. Not because those are the only people alive, but because those are the people within the covenant story, the ones through whom something divine is unfolding. And that means the silence about the others is not a mistake, that it's intentional. Because the story is not about them. But their presence is still there in the background, in the gaps, in the moments where the narrative slips and reveals more than it seems to say. And Cain becomes the first to cross that boundary. The first to leave the sacred center and enter the wider world. The first to show us that the world of Genesis is larger than the garden, larger than one family, larger than a single origin story. And once you see that, the question evolves again. Because if others existed outside Eden, if humanity was already there before Adam's story truly begins, then Adam's role becomes something entirely different. Not the first man, but the first chosen man, the first covenant bearer. And that idea opens the door to one of the most controversial, most debated, and most dangerous questions in all of biblical interpretation. What if Adam was never meant to explain where humans came from, but why they fell? And once that idea takes hold, it doesn't just sit quietly in the background. It begins to rearrange everything, because now you're no longer asking the same question. You're no longer asking, when did humans begin? You're asking something far more precise, far more unsettling. When did covenant begin? When did God choose one from among many and say, you will stand in the center, you will carry responsibility, you will represent something greater than yourself, because that is the thread that begins to emerge, not just in Genesis, but across the entire biblical story. Because this pattern doesn't start and end with Adam, it repeats over and over again like A. signature woven into history. God does not choose everyone at once. He chooses one. Then through that one, he reaches many. He chooses Abraham from among nations, Israel from among peoples, David from among tribes. And every time the pattern is the same: selection, calling, covenant, responsibility, and Adam fits that pattern so perfectly that it almost feels impossible to ignore. Which leads to the idea that has echoed through centuries, debated, rejected, rediscovered, and feared the idea that before Adam, there were others, not myth, not fantasy, but human beings living, breathing, existing, and Adam was chosen from among them. Not because he was biologically different, but because he was given something they were not: covenant. And this is what later thinkers would call the pre-Adamic possibility, not a denial of Genesis, but a deeper reading of it. A recognition that Genesis may not be trying to explain the origin of human biology, but the origin of divine relationship. Because the text itself keeps pointing in that direction, it focuses not on population, but on purpose, not on numbers, but on names. And Adam is the first name. The first one called, the first one given a role that carries weight beyond himself. And if that's true, then Eden itself changes meaning, because it's no longer the place where humans first appeared. It becomes the place where God first enters into covenant with humanity in a direct, personal way, a sacred meeting point, a beginning not of existence, but of responsibility. And that explains something that otherwise feels strange, because outside Eden, life continues, people build, people marry, people create cities, but inside Eden, something different was happening, something more intense, more focused, more sacred, because Adam wasn't just living, he was serving, guarding, representing, standing in a position that no one else in the narrative is given. And when he fails, the consequences are not local, they are universal, not because he is the only human, but because he is the representative human, the covenant head, the one whose role ties him to all others, like a king whose decision affects an entire nation, like a priest whose failure affects an entire people. And suddenly the idea of sin itself begins to look different, because instead of being a biological inheritance passed through blood alone, it becomes something deeper, something covenantal, something tied to broken trust, broken relationship, broken responsibility, something that spreads not just through genetics, but through the condition of humanity itself. Because if the one who stood at the center failed, then everything connected to that center feels the fracture. And this is why later writings, especially in the New Testament, don't talk about Adam as just a distant ancestor. They talk about him as a representative, a figure whose actions define a reality that others step into. And that's where the connection begins to form, quietly at first, but powerfully once you see it. Because Adam is not just the first figure in the story, he is the first pattern, the first template, the first shadow of something greater that is still to come. Because if there is a first covenant man, then there could be another. If there's one who failed, then there could be one who succeeds. And this is where the story begins to stretch forward beyond Genesis, beyond Eden, beyond Cain and his city, into something much larger, something that ties the beginning of the Bible to its end. Something that connects the first pages of Genesis to the life of one man who would later be called something very specific, the last Adam. But before we get there, before that connection fully reveals itself, there's one more layer we have to confront, because if Adam was chosen from among many, if covenant began in Eden, not humanity itself, then the implications ripple outward into everything we think we know, not just about Scripture, but about history, about identity, even about science. Because now another question rises, one that feels modern, almost out of place, but deeply connected. What happens when this ancient story meets everything we've discovered about human origins? What happens when Genesis stands next to genetics? And do they clash, or do they reveal something even deeper when seen together? And this is where the story steps out of the ancient world and into ours. Because for a long time, people believed these questions lived in separate realms, that Genesis belonged to faith and science belonged to facts, that one must eventually cancel the other out. But the deeper you go, the more that assumption begins to fall apart, because science is not asking the same question Genesis is asking. And once you realize that something unexpected happens, the tension begins to transform into something else entirely. Because modern genetics paints a picture of humanity that is vast, complex, and ancient, far older and far more interconnected than earlier generations could have imagined. It tells us that humans did not come from a single pair living at one moment in time, but from populations, groups, communities spreading, mixing, migrating across continents over tens of thousands of years. And within that discovery come two names that sound almost hauntingly familiar. Scientists speak of something called mitochondrial Eve, the woman from whom all humans today inherit their mitochondrial DNA, and another called Y chromosomal Adam, the man from whom all male lineages trace their Y chromosome. And at first glance, it sounds like confirmation, like science has finally caught up with Genesis, but then comes the twist. They didn't live at the same time. Not even close, separated by thousands upon thousands of years, meaning they were not a couple, not walking together, not the first two humans as a pair, but simply the most recent common ancestors in specific genetic lines. And for many, this feels like a contradiction, like a breaking point, like evidence that the biblical story cannot hold. But that conclusion only works if Genesis was ever trying to describe genetics in the first place. And that's where everything begins to shift again. Because Genesis never talks about DNA, never explains chromosomes, never attempts to map biological ancestry in the way science does. Its focus is completely different. It is telling a story about relationship, about responsibility, about covenant, about why humanity is the way it is, not how it physically emerged. So when science says humanity came from populations and Genesis focuses on one man, those two statements are not necessarily in conflict. They're answering different questions. Science is tracing the body. Genesis is tracing the role. Science is explaining the spread of life. Genesis is explaining the fracture within it. And suddenly the idea we've been building begins to fit into place in a way that feels almost too precise to ignore. Because if humanity already existed as populations, as Genesis 1 suggests, and Adam appears later as the chosen man in Genesis 2, then science doesn't erase Adam, it redefines how we understand him. Not as the first biological human, but as the first covenant human, the first one given a role that carries spiritual weight. And that distinction changes everything. Because now Adam's importance is not about being the only ancestor, but about being the first representative, the one through whom something new begins, something that affects everyone not. Because they descend from him physically, but because they exist within the reality shaped by his failure. Because think about it, influence doesn't always require direct descent. A single leader can change the course of entire civilizations. A single decision can ripple across generations. And Adam's role in the narrative is exactly that. Not the origin of humanity's biology, but the origin of humanity's broken covenant. And that's why later writings say that through one man, sin entered the world, not because no one else existed, but because that one man stood at the center of something sacred, something representative, something that connected humanity to God in a direct way. And when that connection broke, it didn't stay contained, it spread, not like a gene, but like a condition, like a reality that humanity stepped into. And suddenly science and Genesis stop fighting. They start aligning in a way that feels deeper than either one alone. Science reveals that humanity is ancient, widespread, interconnected. Genesis reveals that humanity is fractured, accountable, searching for restoration. And both of those truths exist at the same time. Because you can know where you came from biologically and still not know why you feel the weight of something missing. And that's the space Genesis speaks in a .it doesn't tell you how the first human body formed. .it tells you why the human story feels broken. And more importantly, how that brokenness can be restored. Because the moment you understand Adam as the first covenant man, not just the first biological man, another connection becomes impossible to ignore, one that stretches across the entire Bible and reaches its peak in a single figure who is described in a way that mirrors Adam so closely it cannot be coincidence. Because just as there was a first man who carried covenant and failed, there is another who carries it and succeeds. And he is not called the second, that he is called the last Adam. And that is where the story stops looking like ancient mystery and starts looking like a deliberate design. And once that title appears, once you hear it spoken, the last Adam, everything that came before begins to rearrange itself. Because now Adam is no longer just a figure at the beginning of a story. He becomes the first half of a pattern that was always meant to be completed. Because you don't call someone a last unless there was a first. And you don't create that kind of symmetry unless it means something. Because this is exactly how the Apostle Paul the Apostle frames it when he writes about humanity. He doesn't just mention Adam as a distant ancestor. He places him side by side with Jesus Christ, as if the entire human story can be understood through these two figures alone, two representatives, two covenant heads, two turning points that define everything that comes after them. The first Adam becomes a living being. The last Adam becomes a life-giving spirit. And that contrast is not poetic exaggeration. It is structural. It is the backbone of the entire narrative, because everything that went wrong in the first finds its answer in the second, not randomly, but intentionally, almost as if the beginning was designed to point toward the end. Because think about how the pattern unfolds. The first Adam is formed from the dust, shaped from the ground, tied to the earth. The last Adam enters the world through birth, but rises beyond death, no longer bound by the same limitations, no longer held by the same outcome. The first Adam stands in a garden and faces a choice. The last Adam also stands in a garden, a different one, darker, heavier, filled with the weight of what is about to happen. The first Adam reaches for what is forbidden. The last Adam refuses what he could take and instead submits to what he must endure. The first Adam's act leads to separation, exile, the closing of a gate. The last Adam's act leads to restoration, reconciliation, the reopening of a way that was once sealed. And once you see it, the symmetry becomes impossible to ignore. It's not just similar, it's intentional. Because the story is not just history, it's design. And Adam was never meant to be understood fully on his own. He was always pointing forward, always incomplete, always a shadow of something greater that would come later. Because if Adam is the first covenant bearer who failed, then the last Adam is the covenant bearer who succeeds, not just for himself, but for everyone connected to him, just like the first, but in reverse. And that's where the idea of representation reaches its peak. Because just as the first Adam's failure affected all, the last Adam's success also extends beyond himself, not limited to one life, but offered outward, as if the entire human story pivots on which of these two you are connected to. Point one represents brokenness. The other represents restoration. Point one carries the weight of failure. The other carries the power of redemption. And suddenly the story of Genesis is no longer isolated. It becomes the foundation of something much larger, something that stretches across time, something that explains not just where the problem began, but how it can be resolved. Because the idea of covenant that started in Eden doesn't end there, that it evolves, it expands, that it reaches its fulfillment. And that's why the title Last Adam matters so much. Because it means the cycle stops there, that in oh more representatives needed, in oh more repeated failure, in oh more resetting the pattern. Because this time it holds, this time it completes. And if you trace it all the way back, it brings you to a realization that feels both simple and overwhelming at the same time. Adam was never just about the past. He was about the structure of the story itself, that a beginning that required an ending, that a failure that required a resolution, that a shadow that required fulfillment. And that means everything we've uncovered so far, the two creation accounts, the possibility of others outside Eden, the idea of Adam as chosen rather than first, the concept of covenant over biology, all of it was leading here. Because the story was never just asking, where did humans come from? It was asking something deeper. Why is humanity the way it is, and how can it be made whole again? And the answer doesn't sit at the beginning. That it stretches across the entire narrative until it reaches its completion in the last Adam. But even now, there's still one piece left that changes how we see everything we thought we understood about the very place where it all began. Because if Adam was a priest, If covenant began in Eden, if the garden was more than just a place to live, then what exactly was Eden? Was it really just a garden? Or was it something far more sacred, something that connects every part of the story from beginning to end? And this is where everything you thought you understood about Eden begins to expand beyond its limits. Because for most people, the image is simple, almost too simple: a peaceful garden, trees, rivers, animals in harmony, a place of innocence. But the deeper you look, the more that image begins to feel incomplete, like a surface-level picture hiding something far more structured, far more intentional, because the details in the text are not random. They are loaded, symbolic, deliberate. And once you start connecting them, Eden stops looking like a garden and starts looking like something else entirely. Because the Bible itself gives us clues, not directly at first, but scattered across its pages, waiting to be connected. And one of the most striking comes much later through the prophet Ezekiel, who describes Eden in a way that feels almost shocking compared to the simple image we carry. He speaks of Eden not just as a garden, but as the holy mountain of God, a place filled with precious stones, a place where divine presence dwells, a place that sounds less like nature and more like a sanctuary, a temple, a cosmic meeting point between heaven and earth. And once you hear that, once you let that sink in, everything begins to align in a way that feels almost impossible to ignore, because temples in the ancient world were not just buildings. They were designed representations of the cosmos, places where the divine and human realms intersected, places filled with symbolism, structure, meaning, and suddenly the details of Eden start to mirror that pattern perfectly. Think about it. There's a central place, the tree of life, positioned not randomly, but at the heart, like the center of a sanctuary. There are rivers flowing outward, not inward, flowing from the center to the rest of the world, just like later temple imagery, where life flows from the presence of God outward into creation. There are precious materials mentioned: gold, stones, elements that later become central in the construction of sacred spaces. And then there are the cherubim, placed at the entrance after the fall, guarding the way, not just as random creatures, but as temple guardians, the same beings later depicted in the most sacred parts of Israel's temple, standing at the boundary between the holy and the ordinary. And when you put all of that together, the picture becomes clear in a way that changes everything. Eden was not just a garden that was the first temple. The first place where God's presence dwelled on earth in a direct, tangible way. The first sacred space where heaven and earth overlapped. And if that's true, then Adam's role becomes even more defined, more precise, more intense, because now he is not just placed in a location, he is placed in a sanctuary and is tasked to work and keep. It takes on its full meaning, not agriculture, but priesthood, not survival, but service, not maintenance of land, but protection of holiness, that he is standing at the center of creation, acting as a mediator, a bridge, someone whose role is to maintain the connection between God and the world. And that means his failure was not just personal, that it was cosmic. Because when a priest fails in a temple, the consequences are not contained, they spread, they break the connection, they disrupt the flow between the sacred and the ordinary. And suddenly the fall is no longer just about eating fruit, that it becomes something much heavier, that it becomes the desecration of sacred space. Because the one who was meant to guard the temple allowed something unclean to enter it, the serpent. And that detail becomes critical, because the serpent is not just a random animal in this context. It represents intrusion, chaos, something that does not belong in sacred space, something that should have been confronted, resisted, removed, and yet Adam allows the conversation to happen, allows the boundary to blur, allows the order to break. And in that moment, the temple is no longer pure. The sanctuary is no longer guarded. The connection is fractured, and the result is exile. And now exile itself begins to make more sense, because it mirrors something we see repeated later throughout Scripture. Whenever sacred space is violated, access is removed, the presence withdraws, the people are sent out, and the place is guarded. And that's exactly what happens here. Adam and Eve are driven out. The entrance is sealed. Cherubim stand guard with flaming swords, and the way back is closed. not just physically, but spiritually. And this pattern echoes again and again across history. Israel builds a temple, it becomes corrupted. They are exiled. The temple is destroyed. The presence departs. The pattern repeats because it started here in Eden, the first temple lost. And once you see that, the entire Bible begins to feel like one continuous story, not disconnected events, but a single arc, beginning with a temple where humanity dwelled with God, moving through attempts to restore that connection through tabernacles, through temples, through covenant after covenant. Each one trying to rebuild what was lost, each one pointing forward to something greater. Because the ultimate goal is not just forgiveness, that it's restoration. Restoration of presence. Restoration of connection. Restoration of that original space where heaven and earth meet. And that's why the idea of Eden matters so much, because it's not just where humanity began, it's what humanity lost. Access, proximity, union. And everything that follows is about getting back to that. But here's where the mystery deepens even further. Because if Eden was the center, if it was the sacred place, if it was the temple, then what does that say about everything outside it? Because temples are not the whole world. They're the center of it. Which means beyond Eden, the rest of the world was already there, waiting, existing, unfolding, and Adam was placed at the center of it, not to begin it, but to represent it.t, O connect, it.t, O guard the point where heaven touched earth. And when he failed, it wasn't just a man falling, it was the center collapsing. And that collapse echoes through every part of the human story. But it also sets something else in motion. Because if the first temple was lost, then the story is no longer just about lost. It becomes about rebuilding, about restoration, about something or someone who can do what Adam could not. And that brings us to the final question that ties everything together, the question that has been building from the very beginning, quietly, steadily, now ready to be faced in full, that if Eden was the first temple and Adam was its first priest, then who restores the temple? Who reopens the way? Who brings humanity back to that place where heaven and earth meet again? And now everything comes together, not as separate ideas, not as scattered mysteries, but as one continuous thread. Because if you follow the story from the very beginning, from the moment humanity steps out of Eden, from the moment the gate closes and the cherubim stand guard, something begins that defines the entire human experience, a distance, a separation, a sense that something has been lost that cannot be easily regained, and every generation after carries it, even if they don't fully understand it. Because the story after Eden is not just history unfolding, that it is humanity trying to return, trying to rebuild what was broken, trying to reach back toward that place where God and man once walked together without fear. And you can see it everywhere if you look closely. Altars begin to appear, sacrifices begin to be offered, sacred spaces begin to form, not randomly, but as echoes, as attempts to recreate something that once existed in its purest form. Because deep down, the memory of Eden never fully disappears, that it lingers, that it drives, that it shapes everything that comes after. And this is why the story moves from a garden to a tent, from Eden to the tabernacle, that a portable sanctuary, carefully constructed, filled with symbolism that mirrors the garden itself. The lampstand shaped like a tree, the presence of God dwelling in the center, the separation between, the holy and the outside, all of it designed not as something new, but as a reconstruction of what was lost. And then the tent becomes a temple, that a fixed place, that a structure built to house the presence again. But even then, it's not complete, because access is still limited. The veil still separates. The fullness of Eden is not yet restored, that it's close, but not the same. Because something deeper still needs to happen. Something that cannot be solved by buildings or rituals alone. Because the problem was never just a loss of a place.it, was the failure of the priest. And until that is resolved, the temple can never fully function the way it was meant to. And this is where the story reaches its turning point. Because the pattern that began with Adam finally meets its fulfillment in Jesus Christ, not as a distant echo, but as the direct answer to everything that came before. because he does something no one else could do. He doesn't just enter a temple, he becomes it. The place where heaven and earth meet is no longer a garden or a building. It becomes a person. And that changes everything. Because now access is no longer about location, that it's about connection. And the role that Adam failed to carry is taken up again, but this time without failure, without collapse, without breaking. Because where Adam stood in the garden and allowed the boundary to fall, Christ stands and restores it. Where Adam's choice led to exile, Christ's obedience leads to return. Where the first priest failed to guard the sacred space, the last priest reopens it completely. And the moment that defines it all is not in Eden, but on a cross, because that is where the separation is dealt with fully, where the barrier that began in the garden is broken, and something incredible happens in that moment that often goes unnoticed. The veil in the temple tears, not slowly, not partially, but completely, from top to bottom. And that detail matters, because it's not just a dramatic event, it's a signal that a declaration that the separation is over. The way back is open. The presence is no longer locked behind boundaries. The gate that was closed in Eden has been reopened, and suddenly, the entire story makes sense in a way it never did before. Because it was never just about where humanity began. It was about how humanity returns. And that return doesn't happen through going back to a physical. Garden.it happens through restoration of relationship, through the rebuilding of what was broken at the center. Because Eden was never just a place on earth.it was a condition, a state of being, a reality where God and man were in perfect connection. And that is what is restored, not by reversing time, but by fulfilling the story. And this is why the Bible doesn't end with a return to the old Eden. It ends with something even greater, a new creation, a new reality where the presence of God is not confined to one space, but fills everything. Where there is no temple, because everything becomes the temple. Where there is no separation, because nothing is broken anymore. Where the tree of life appears again, not guarded this time, but open, accessible, restored. And that final image mirrors the beginning, but it's not identical, it's greater, because what was once lost has now been reclaimed fully, permanently, completely. And that brings us back to the question that started it all. Who was here before Adam? And the answer, after everything we've seen, almost feels secondary, because the story was never trying to give you a list of names. It was inviting you into something deeper to understand that Adam was not just the first man, but the first covenant man, the first priest, the first chosen one. Placed at the center of sacred story. A story that begins with creation, moves through failure, and ends with restoration. And once you see it that way, Genesis is no longer just the beginning. It becomes the opening. Move in a story that was always meant to lead somewhere far greater. Not just to explain where we came from, but to reveal where we are going. And even though the story feels complete, even though the arc from Adam to restoration seems to close perfectly, there's something still lingering beneath the surface, something the Bible hints at, but never fully spells out. Because if Eden was the first temple, if it was the meeting point between heaven and earth, then it wasn't just important to humanity.it was important to something else, something watching, something that understood what that place meant. Because sacred space is never ignored. It is contested. And that brings us to a layer of the story most people never connect, a layer that runs parallel to everything we've already uncovered, hidden in prophetic visions, scattered across ancient texts, whispered through symbols that feel strange until you place them back into the context of Eden. Because remember that detail we touched on earlier, almost briefly, almost like a passing clue, the description given through Ezekiel, where Eden is not just a garden, but a holy mountain, a place of stones, fire, presence. And then something even more unsettling appears in that same vision. A figure, described as being in Eden, described as walking among those stones, described as once being close to the presence of God, and then falling. And suddenly the story begins to stretch beyond humanity entirely, because now Eden is not just the stage of human failure. It may have been the stage of a rebellion that happened before or at least alongside it. And that changes the atmosphere completely. Because now the serpent is no longer just a random creature entering the garden. It becomes something intentional, something that knows what it's doing, something that understands the significance of that space, because you don't invade a temple by accident, you target it. And if Adam's role was to guard that sacred space, then the presence of the serpent reveals something critical. There was opposition. There was already a tension between order and chaos, between obedience and rebellion, between the presence of God and something that sought to disrupt it. And Adam stood in the middle of that tension, not just as a man, but as a guardian, a priest, the defender of the boundary between the sacred and the corrupted. And when he failed, the consequences didn't just affect humanity, they opened the door wider, because what was once contained in a single act now becomes a condition that spreads across the entire human story. Violence appears, corruption grows, and the world outside Eden begins to reflect something darker than simple survival. Because the next chapters of Genesis don't describe a peaceful expansion of humanity. They describe a world unraveling, a world where the line between order and chaos continues to blur. And that leads directly into another story, a story that at first feels separate, but is actually deeply connected. The story of the flood. Because when you reach that moment, when the narrative says that the earth was filled with violence, that corruption had spread everywhere, it doesn't describe it as a small problem. IT describes it as total AS, if something had gone fundamentally wrong, not just in behavior, but in the structure of the world itself. And that's where another strange detail appears. The mention of beings that don't fully fit into the human category. The sons of God taking human women, producing something, described as giants, the Nephilim. And suddenly the story widens again, because now we're no longer dealing only with human failure, but we're dealing with a mixing of boundaries, a crossing of lines that were never meant to be crossed. And if you connect that back to Eden, to the failure to guard sacred space, to the entrance of the serpent, to the collapse of the first temple, it begins to feel less like random chaos and more like escalation, like a boundary once broken that continues to break further. And the flood becomes not just judgment, but reset an attempt to cleanse what had become corrupted beyond recognition. Preserve a line. Preserve a possibility. Keep the story from collapsing entirely. Because remember, the Bible's focus is always the covenant line, the thread that leads forward, the one that cannot be lost, from Adam to Seth to Noah and beyond. And that means even in the middle of chaos, even in the middle of corruption, the story is still moving forward, still building toward something, still aiming toward restoration, but now with a new layer added. Because it's not just humanity that needs restoration, that it's the entire structure. The relationship between heaven and earth, the boundaries that were broken, the sacred space that was lost. And that's why the story doesn't end with the flood, that IT continues. Because even after the reset, humanity still struggles, still fails, still repeats the pattern, which tells you something important. The problem was never just the environment, that IT was deeper. IT was rooted in the condition itself. And that's why everything we talked about earlier about covenant, about representation, about the need for a perfect priest becomes even more necessary. Because if the first failure opened the door and everything after made it worse, then the solution cannot be partial. It has to be complete, final, unbreakable. And that brings us back again to the last Adam, because now his role is not just to fix what Adam broke, it's to restore everything that unraveled after close what was opened, repair what was corrupted, reestablish what was lost not just in Eden, but in everything that followed. And when you see the story this way, it's no longer just a question of beginnings. IT becomes a story of conflict, of invasion, of loss, of restoration, a story that starts in a garden, moves through a broken world, and ends with something far greater than what was first lost. But even now, one final realization remains, because if Eden was the first temple, and if everything since has been about restoring that connection, then the question is no longer just theological, that IT becomes personal. Because the story is not just about Adam, that it's not just about ancient history, that it's about you. About where you stand in that story. Between the first Adam and the last. Between the loss and the restoration. And whether you are still outside the garden or stepping back into what was always meant to be. And this is where the story does something unexpected, something almost uncomfortable, because after everything we've uncovered, after the mysteries of Genesis, the hidden layers of Eden, the possibility of others beyond the garden, the rise of covenant, the collapse of sacred space, the spread of corruption, the flood, the restoration, the arrival of the last Adam. After all of that, the story doesn't end out there in the distance. It turns, and it points inward, because the truth is this was never meant to stay as ancient history. It was never meant to be just a story you listen to, analyze, and move on from. It was designed to pull you in, to place you inside it, to make you realize that everything you've just heard is not just about them, it's about you. Because if Adam was the first covenant man, then what he represents didn't disappear, it continued. It echoes through every generation, not just in belief, but in experience, because every human life follows the same pattern in ways that are almost impossible to ignore once you see it clearly. You begin a kind of innocence, not perfect, but unaware. Then comes the moment of choice, the moment where you know, the moment where something inside you recognizes the difference between what is right and what is not. And then comes the tension, the pull, the voice that says, take it. The voice that says step outside the boundary. The voice that whispers the same thing the serpent whispered at the beginning. And what happens next defines everything. Because just like Adam, every person faces that moment, not once, but over and over again. And just like Adam, the outcome is rarely perfect, the boundary is crossed, the choice is made, and something shifts inside, something that feels almost ancient, almost familiar. Like you're stepping into a pattern that existed long before you. Because you are, and that's why the story feels so real, even thousands of years later, because it's not just describing the first human experience, that it's describing the human experience. And that's where the weight of it all begins to land. Because if the story is true on that level, then it's not just about understanding something, that it's about recognizing something. Recognizing that the distance, the separation, the sense that something isn't quite right, isn't just random, it's part of the same fracture that began at the center. But here's where it shifts again, because just as the story doesn't leave Adam in failure, it doesn't leave you there either, because the introduction of the last Adam changes the direction completely. Because now the story is no longer just a pattern of failure repeating endlessly, that it becomes a pattern that can be broken. And that's the part that changes everything. Because if the first Adam represents the condition, then Jesus Christ represents the solution, not just historically, but personally, because the same way Adam's role extended beyond himself, the role of the last Adam does too. And that means the story offers something, not just explanation, but invitation, an invitation to step out of one pattern and into another, to move from the cycle of failure, into the possibility of restoration, to move from distance back toward connection. And this is where the idea of Eden returns one last time, not as a physical location you have to find, not as a place hidden somewhere in the world, but as something deeper, something internal, something restored through relationship rather than geography. Because the return to Eden was never about going back, it was about becoming new. And that's why the story ends not with a map, but with a transformation. Because the final vision is not just about a place where God and humanity are together again, that it's about a reality where that connection is permanent, unbroken, fully restored. And the gate that was once closed never closes again. And when you step back and look at the entire arc from the first page to the last, from the creation of humanity to the restoration of everything, you begin to see it clearly. This was never just a story about beginnings, that it was always a story about direction, about where things went wrong and how they can be made right, about a first Adam who opened the door to something broken and a last Adam who opens the door to something restored. And now the question that remains is no longer hidden in ancient texts, that it's right here, right now, because the story has reached you. And the only thing left is to decide which part of it you're standing in. And now, as the story folds back on itself, connecting what came before with what is happening now, something remarkable begins to emerge. The tale doesn't stay confined to ancient text or the echoes of Eden. It reaches outward, bridging into other stories, other worlds, other voices that were always running parallel, but hidden until now. Because the narrative of Adam and the last Adam, the fractures of humanity and the promise of restoration, doesn't exist in isolation. It intersects with every thread of human history, every myth, every legend, every story told across cultures, from the heroes of Greece to the sages of India, from the wanderers of the desert to the kings of Babylon. And suddenly, the realization hits. This is the story behind all stories, the spine that supports every tale of struggle, redemption, and transformation ever told. You start to see the connections in ways you never noticed. The exile of Adam mirrors the wandering of Moses. The flood echoes in the cataclysms of cultures lost to time. The promise of restoration in the last Adam resonates with every hero's return, every prodigal's journey home, every act of courage that flips despair into hope. These aren't just coincidences. They're the fingerprints of a singular narrative flowing through countless lives, across every era, threading them together like an invisible loom. And then it becomes intensely personal again, because you begin to realize that these connections aren't abstract. They aren't distant. Every story ever told, every parable, every myth, every account of failure and triumph, all of it is whispering the same truth directly into your life. The struggles, the choices, the cycles of defeat and renewal, they're not merely historic. They are lived moment by moment inside you. The pattern repeats. Temptation, failure, awareness, redemption. But the difference now is clarity. Now, the lessons are visible. The door that once seemed locked is now open. The paths that once seemed uncertain are illuminated. And the other stories, the ones that seemed separate, suddenly make sense because they were always part of the same tapestry. You start to see yourself in those tales of old. Each hero, each wandering figure, each seeker, and even each villain reflects a part of your journey. And the astonishing realization hits. The narrative doesn't end with the last Adam. It continues. It continues through every choice, every step, every moment of awareness you have in your life. The story becomes simultaneously infinite and intimate. It is vast, stretching across cultures and epochs. Yet it is yours. Yours to live, yours to learn from, yours to continue. You are not just a reader. You are a participant. You are part of this eternal thread, carrying the echoes of Adam's failure and the promise of the last Adam's restoration forward into the now. And in that realization lies the power of the story. It transforms from something observed into something lived. It shifts from ancient narrative into ongoing experience. It is not just a story you can tell. It is a story you can embody, a story that moves through you, shaping you, guiding you, offering both caution and hope. And here, as the story stretches its arms outward, connecting you with every other narrative ever told, it whispers one final truth. You are not separate from what has come before. You are not powerless in what comes next. The story is not over. It is living, it is breathing, and it is calling you forward. Because every choice you make now, every step you take, every act of courage, wisdom, and love, it becomes part of this continuum, part of this grand tapestry, part of a story that began at creation and continues through the ages, now passing through you. And if you listen closely, if you allow yourself to step fully inside it, you hear the promise once more. The gate that was closed can open, the lost can be found, and the broken can be made whole. Not someday, not somewhere else, but here now. In the life you are living, as the story continues, it begins to fold time in on itself. The echoes of ancient events ripple forward, touching moments that were never meant to connect, yet now converge in ways that feel both inevitable and startling. The exile of Adam, the promise of the last Adam, and the wandering of countless others through deserts, cities, and forests. All of it becomes more than history. It becomes a lens through which every new choice, every new challenge, every new connection can be seen at I end this moment. The story turns to the unnoticed figures who once seemed peripheral, the ones who did not make the headlines of history, but whose lives were quietly monumental. A shepherd watching stars in Babylon, a healer walking the streets of Alexandria, a soldier resting at the edge of a battlefield. These lives, small and fleeting on the surface, carry the same thread of humanity that runs from Eden to now. Every act of kindness, every choice for courage or truth, every decision to rise despite fear, forms the invisible thread that links these lives across time and space. And suddenly, the story starts to hint at something more, a bridge into another tale, another world, another set of challenges. From the shadows of past civilizations emerges a connection to the present struggles of humankind. The struggles are mirrored in the lives of people across continents. A merchant navigating the treacherous streets of Istanbul centuries ago, a scholar deciphering forgotten scrolls in Cairo, a wanderer braving storms along the Mediterranean coast. Each of them unknowingly carries the lessons of Adam, the echoes of the last Adam, and the wisdom of those who came before. Here, the story takes a subtle but profound turn. It asks, what if all stories are variations of the same journey? What if every myth, legend, and history is a reflection of the same universal struggle? Humanity grappling with failure, temptation, hope, and redemption. And what if, through recognizing these patterns, one could see the invisible connections linking past, present, and future? At the same time, the narrative doesn't shy away from complexity. Darkness still looms. Temptation remains. Choices can lead to ruin as easily as to restoration. But now, the awareness of these connections becomes a tool, a map of sorts, showing where others have stumbled and where they have risen. Each lesson is a beacon, each story a compass, guiding those who are willing to see beyond the immediate moment. And just as the story seems to settle into this rhythm of reflection and understanding, a new horizon opens. A whisper of a journey not yet taken begins to form on the edges of awareness. A journey that will test courage, challenge assumptions, and ultimately stretch the understanding of what it means to live within the thread of these interwoven stories. Because in this vast tapestry, one truth becomes undeniable. The story is alive. It is not confined to the pages of history or myth. It is breathing, moving, and reaching outward, touching every life, every choice, every moment. And it beckons, inviting you, and all who will listen, to step into its flow and see where it leads next. The threads are converging. The journey is expanding. And the next chapter waits, ready to push the boundaries of what has come before, drawing the past, the present, and the unknown future into one sweeping, interlaced adventure. The whisper of the new journey grew louder, transforming from a subtle murmur into a persistent call that could no longer be ignored. It started in the minds of those who had felt the threads of the past tug at their hearts. Travelers, wanderers, and seekers who had always sensed that their lives were part of something greater. Each had faced trials, loss, betrayal, temptation. But now, a new purpose began to crystallize, one that would take them far beyond the familiar landscapes of their history and memory. In one place, a young scholar in Alexandria studied fragments of manuscripts, their edges brittle and ink-faded. The writing spoke of maps, not of land, but of fate, of invisible paths connecting one life to another. Though she did not fully understand the language of the texts, she felt the weight of their truth pressing against her consciousness. Every symbol, every line, was a reminder that the past and present were inseparable, that every decision, even those made centuries ago, shaped the world she now inhabited. Far to the north, on the rocky cliffs of a distant coast, a fisherman stared into the restless sea. The waves roared with stories of journeys yet to come, whispering of storms that would challenge him in ways the sea alone could not. Yet beneath the fear, a sense of anticipation stirred. The sea was no longer just a barrier. It was a doorway. The winds carried secrets, lessons from those who had come before, urging him to take the first step, however uncertain it might seem. Meanwhile, in a bustling city where streets twisted like veins and voices overlapped in a constant hum, A healer moved silently among the sick and wounded. She sensed the undercurrent of destiny in the people around her, the faint glimmers of potential in those who had forgotten their own strength. And as she tended to their bodies, she also tended to the invisible threads connecting them, mending not only flesh, but the hidden networks of trust, courage, and hope. The horizon itself seemed to pulse with life. Mountains rose like guardians, rivers shimmered like mirrors reflecting choices yet unmade, and forests whispered secrets older than memory. Everywhere, the world invited exploration, promising danger and discovery in equal measure. And at the heart of it, unseen yet unmistakable, was the convergence of the stories, the moment where paths would cross, lessons would collide, and destinies would intertwine. But as the travelers felt this pull, a shadow moved across the edge of their awareness. Not all threads were meant to be followed, and not all paths led to light. Temptation lingered in forms both subtle and profound. The lure of power, the comfort of ignorance, the quiet insistence that the past was irrelevant. To heed the call of the horizon required courage, and courage demanded not just strength, but understanding. The ability to see the patterns woven through time, to recognize the echoes of mistakes and triumphs, and to act in alignment with what was truly right. And so, with the horizon stretching endlessly before them, the journey began in earnest. Each step carried the weight of history and the spark of possibility. Every encounter became a lesson, every choice a ripple that could shape futures unseen. The story had grown larger than any single life, larger than any single moment, and yet it remained intimate, a tapestry woven from individual courage, wisdom, and heart. The threads of the past had opened a door. The horizon had called, and those who answered now would find that the journey was far greater, far deeper, and far more intricate than anything they could have imagined. The horizon was no longer just a distant promise. It had become a tangible presence, a living challenge that pressed against the minds and hearts of those who had answered its call. The travelers, each carrying the weight of their past, began to sense that the journey ahead was unlike anything they had faced before. It was not a single obstacle, a solitary villain, or a simple riddle of the mind. It was a convergence of forces, both seen and unseen, that would test everything they had learned, everything they thought they knew about themselves. The scholar in Alexandria, once content to study ancient fragments, now felt a new urgency. The maps she had deciphered were shifting, morphing into patterns she had never noticed before. What once seemed like abstract symbols now revealed pathways, some luminous, some dark, leading toward destinations that existed outside the ordinary flow of time. And as she traced these lines with trembling fingers, she realized that the paths were not just hers to follow. Others were moving along them too, their choices intertwined with hers in ways she could barely comprehend. Far to the north, the fisherman had finally set sail, leaving behind the familiar coast that had sheltered him all his life. The sea, which had seemed a canvas of possibility, now churned with hidden currents, some gentle, some violent. Shadows flickered beneath the waves, creatures, or perhaps illusions, reminding him that the horizon carried not only hope but danger. With each gust of wind and each crashing wave, he felt the pull of something greater, something ancient and relentless. It demanded vigilance, demanded sacrifice, and yet impossibly, it also whispered of triumph beyond imagining. In the bustling city, the healer sensed a gathering storm, not of weather, but of intentions. The invisible threads she had been mending now trembled with tension. People she had thought were allies began to reveal hidden agendas. Friends showed signs of doubt, and strangers carried glimmers of knowledge they were not yet ready to share. Every act of kindness, every moment of trust, had consequences she could not yet predict. And somewhere in the shadows, forces that had long slept were awakening, drawn by the same horizon that called her. Across the lands, an ancient presence stirred. It had waited patiently, silent but aware, watching generations rise and fall. This presence was neither wholly malevolent nor benevolent. It was a force of balance, a shadow cast by the sum of human ambition and desire. It had observed the travelers from afar, noting their courage and their vulnerabilities, and now it began to test them. Small at first, a misleading sign here, a sudden loss there, a whisper that sowed doubt. But the pattern was clear. The horizon was a crucible, and the travelers would not emerge unscathed. And yet, even as shadows lengthened, there were sparks of brilliance. Moments of clarity, of unity, of unexpected courage illuminated the path. The scholar shared her insights with those she met along the way. The fisherman learned to read not just the waves, but the currents of human intent. The healer discovered new ways to protect and inspire those around her. Each lesson, each revelation strengthened them, even as the challenges intensified. The horizon, once a distant line between sky and earth, had transformed into a living narrative. Every choice, every hesitation, every leap forward shaped not only the journey ahead, but the very essence of the world they traversed. And as the first true trial began to emerge, a force both familiar and alien, a test that would demand intellect, courage, and heart, the travelers realized that the story was no longer theirs alone. It belonged to the horizon, to history, and to the vast, unfolding tapestry of fate itself beyond dawn. The travelers had reached a plateau overlooking a valley that seemed alive with whispers. The air itself carried tension, vibrating as though it were attuned to every heartbeat of those who had come this far. The horizon they had chased for so long no longer appeared distant. It pressed against their eyes like a mirror reflecting possibilities and perils at once. And in that mirror, a new truth became unavoidable. The journey was no longer about reaching a place, but surviving what awaited them there. From the valley below rose a sound, low, rhythmic, and insistent. It was a pulse almost like a heartbeat, but vast, ancient, and unyielding. The scholar, whose mind had always sought patterns, recognized something uncanny in its rhythm. "It's a test," she murmured, her voice taut with both fear and wonder. "Not just a trial of strength, but of perception, of choices. This will decide if we even have the right to continue." The fisherman's gaze scanned the valley. Mist curled like serpents around jagged stones, and the waters of a winding river reflected an impossible twilight. Shadows moved where no shadows should exist, twisting in forms that suggested eyes, limbs, and intentions. He felt the pull of the currents beneath his boots, as though the land itself had become a living force. A chill ran down his spine. He knew instinctively that a misstep here could fracture more than bones. It could fracture the journey itself. And then the healer felt it, a pulse beneath the soil, like roots writhing with hidden life. The threads of human connection she had been nurturing now quivered, strained by invisible weight. Friends who had seemed trustworthy now seemed haunted by subtle whispers of doubt, their hearts pulled by forces unseen. Even the healer herself felt the tension pressing against her chest. She realized with sudden clarity that this trial was not only external, it was internal. Every fear, every hesitation, every suppressed desire could become a weapon against them. From the center of the valley, a figure, or perhaps a manifestation, emerged. It was tall, impossibly thin, with a cloak that seemed to absorb the light around it. The travelers could not tell if it was human, spirit, or something older, something born of the horizon itself. Its voice, when it spoke, was not loud but deep, vibrating through the very air. All who seek the horizon must prove they understand it, not through knowledge alone, not through courage alone, but through choice. Step forward or be left behind. The travelers exchanged glances. For the first time, their unity felt fragile. The scholar's voice trembled, yet carried determination. "We cannot turn back. Whatever this is, we face it together." The figure's cloak shifted, revealing a path illuminated by pale, flickering light. Along the path, strange markings glimmered, symbols that seemed both ancient and alive, shifting with each step the travelers took. The valley itself seemed to pulse, as if every movement they made was being observed and measured. The fisherman tightened his grip on his staff, ready for anything. The healer placed her hand gently on his arm, grounding them both. The scholars studied the symbols, attempting to decipher them before they became obstacles too dangerous to navigate. Step by step, they advanced, aware that each choice mattered. The path forked, twisted, and occasionally disappeared into mist, only to re-emerge elsewhere. The figure's words echoed endlessly. Choice defines the worthy. Choice defines the horizon. It was the first true trial, the beginning of a gauntlet designed to test everything they were. And as the travelers pressed on, they could feel the horizon drawing nearer, but in a way that promised no comfort. It demanded vigilance, demanded unity, demanded courage the likes of which they had never summoned before. And in that moment, the travelers understood the horizon was no longer just a place to reach. It was a force, a trial, and a reckoning all at once. Every step forward would reveal not just what lay ahead, but who they truly were. The travelers stepped onto the path that twisted like a silver river through the valley, its edges fading into the fog. Each of them felt the air grow heavier, as if it carried not just mist, but the weight of judgment. The pale light from the figure's cloak shimmered on the strange markings on the ground, symbols that shifted with every glance, almost as though they were alive. The scholar crouched to examine them. These symbols, they aren't just warnings, she said, tracing one with a finger. They're questions. Each mark, it's asking something about us. Our fears, our desires, our intentions. One wrong answer could change everything. The healer shivered. Change everything meaning what? Our path. Or us. Her voice barely rose above a whisper, yet it carried the tremor of an instinctive fear they all shared. The fisherman's eyes darted across the mist. Whatever it is, we can't freeze here. We move together, or we fail together. The first test appeared as they reached a fork in the path, though at first glance it seemed natural enough. A simple divergence into two trails. But the valley was no ordinary place. One path shimmered faintly, lined with smooth stones that pulsed under their feet, giving a sense of ease, of comfort. The other path was jagged, overgrown with twisted roots that seemed to reach out, almost inviting them to stumble. The scholar frowned. The easier path, it tempts. That is never the correct choice. The difficult path, it is uncertain. But perhaps that is the test. Before they could deliberate further, the mist thickened and a voice echoed. Not the figures this time, but a chorus, rising and falling in cadence. Choose or be divided. Choose wisely or be lost. The travelers felt a subtle shift in their own minds. Doubts crept in like frost over glass. Was the scholar's instinct correct? Did the easier path truly hide danger? Did the harder path offer safety or certain doom? And worse, what if they disagreed? It was the healer who moved first, stepping toward the jagged path. We must not let fear guide us, she said firmly. We step together, even if it's the harder road. The fisherman nodded, planting his staff firmly. Then we follow, no hesitation. The scholar's lips pressed into a thin line. She wanted to argue, to weigh every possible outcome, but something in the air pressed against reasoning, demanding trust. And so, with a deep breath, she followed. The path immediately changed beneath their feet. Roots shifted like serpents, rocks tilted, and the mist thickened into forms that whispered accusations, fears, and temptations. Illusions of loved ones appeared, calling for them to turn back, offering safety, comfort, or forbidden power. The first test was not physical. It was psychological. The shadows whispered secrets, secrets only their hearts could know. The healer saw visions of friends who doubted her, accusing her of failure. The fisherman glimpsed the riverbank of his village, calling him home, begging him to abandon this perilous journey. The scholar was confronted by every failed calculation, every misjudgment in her life, projected in twisted, mocking forms. Yet despite the weight of illusions, they held their course. Together, step by step, they pushed forward, repeating each other's names as if to anchor themselves to reality. Hours, maybe days, passed. Time felt warped in the valley. Yet eventually, the path opened onto a plateau high above the valley floor. There, the figure awaited again, its cloak fluttering with a sound like dry leaves. It extended one impossibly long arm, revealing an object suspended in light, a crystal that pulsed with a heartbeat of its own. You have passed the first trial, the figure intoned. But this is only the beginning. The choices you make now will echo beyond this valley, touching lives you do not yet know and paths you cannot yet see. The travelers looked at each other, breathless but unbroken. The crystal's pulse resonated with their own hearts, as if syncing their fates with its rhythm. The scholar whispered, almost to herself, "It's not just a horizon we're chasing, it's understanding. Understanding of ourselves and of what lies beyond." The healer nodded, her eyes never leaving the crystal. "And we must be ready for the trials we cannot yet imagine." The fisherman adjusted his grip on his staff. "Whatever comes next, we face it together. That is the only certainty we have." And with that unspoken agreement, they stepped forward once more, toward the crystal, toward the next trial, and into a horizon that promised revelations, dangers, and connections to stories that had already begun elsewhere. A larger tapestry whose threads they were only just beginning to touch. The travelers had barely stepped beyond the crystal when the air itself seemed to split. The valley behind them dissolved into fragments of mist and shadow, leaving only faint echoes of the paths they had taken. Ahead, the plateau stretched, but now the horizon shimmered with impossible shapes. Mountains that bent skyward at impossible angles, rivers that flowed upward, and forests that swayed against the wind as if they had a mind of their own. The figure remained at the edge of the plateau, watching silently. Its voice, when it came, seemed to resonate in the bones of the travelers rather than their ears. Beyond this point, the threads of your fate entwine with those you have not yet met, and those you have never imagined. The world you knew is only one version of what might be. The scholar's heart skipped. Threads entwined? Do you mean other stories? Other people, other trials? Yes, the figure replied. The choices you make here will ripple across countless lives. Some you will encounter directly, others only indirectly. The paths are fractal, and the echoes of your courage, or your hesitation, will reach farther than you realize. Before the travelers could respond, a rift tore open in the air like a jagged tear in fabric. Through it, shapes moved, figures from distant lands, caught mid-struggle or mid-quest, their eyes wide with the recognition of danger. Among them, the scholar thought she glimpsed a knight with a burning crest and a warrior whose armor was cracked yet glowing from within. These figures looked as real as the travelers themselves, yet distant, as if reflected through water. The healer whispered, "It's them. People from other stories." The fisherman gripped his staff tighter. "And they're coming here, or we're going to them." The figure's cloak shifted, revealing a faint glimmer beneath, like the threads of countless lives woven into a tapestry. "You are at the convergence. What happens here will affect them, and they may, in turn, affect you. Be vigilant. Trust is your anchor, but discernment your shield." The scholar's mind raced. A convergence, that means our trials aren't isolated. Every step forward could alter events elsewhere. Entire worlds could shift based on what we do. The crystal pulsed again, and the travelers felt the vibrations run through their limbs, connecting them to the other lives glimpsed in the rift. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. The possibilities seemed infinite, but the risks even greater. Suddenly, one figure from the rift stepped forward, a warrior clad in scorched armor, eyes blazing with unspoken fury. She raised her hand, and a wave of force rippled outward, bending reality itself around the travelers. The plateau beneath them trembled. Rocks lifted, roots twisted, and the mist from the valley swirled into towering pillars. The healer cried out, "We need to move. Together." The travelers locked eyes, silently reaffirming their bond. This was no longer just about surviving their own trials. Their courage now intertwined with the fates of others, strangers who were suddenly part of their story. As they pressed forward, the fractured landscape responded to their intent. The path formed beneath their feet, but each step required not just strength, but clarity of heart and mind. Every illusion, every whisper from the mist, tested not only their resolve, but their understanding of connection. How their actions here might ripple into unknown lives across unknown worlds. The scholar paused, gazing into the rift. We're not just walking a path, we're shaping it. Every choice we make now will echo there in ways we can't yet measure. A sudden roar split the air. From the depths of the rift, shadows of creatures long forgotten by time surged forward. Monstrous forms with multiple limbs, eyes that glowed with malice, and whispers that clawed at the mind. The fisherman raised his staff, planting it firmly in the ground. No hosetashin. If they break through, everything we've survived here is for nothing. The healer's hands glowed, weaving protective wards that shimmered like glass. The scholar recalculated, not numbers, but angles, probabilities, and paths through the chaos. Together, they moved in synchronicity, a unit forged in trials past, yet aware now of the wider tapestry of existence. And in the distance, the figure in the cloak watched silently, its presence both a warning and a promise, that beyond the rift lay not only danger but revelation. The travelers' next steps would determine not just their fate, but the fate of countless others, threads intertwining in ways no one could fully predict. For in this convergence, the story they had been living was no longer just their own. It was part of something infinitely larger, and the journey ahead would challenge everything they believed about courage, trust, and destiny. The plateau quivered beneath their feet as the rift widened, stretching like a living wound in the sky. The travelers could now clearly see the figures they had glimpsed before, moving with purpose, each carrying the weight of their own battles, yet drawn inexorably toward the same center. The air itself hummed with tension, like the prelude to a storm no eye could see. The scholar stepped forward, trying to speak, but her voice faltered. The warrior from the other story, a towering figure clad in blackened, scorched armor, paused mid-stride, turning eyes that glowed faintly like molten metal toward them. There was recognition there, though neither could explain it. Somehow, their destinies had collided. "You've crossed the threshold," the cloaked figure whispered, appearing behind them once more. Its words flowed like silk over the edge of a knife. "Here, your story and theirs entwine. What you do now will ripple outward, changing outcomes you cannot yet perceive." The healer took a deep breath, feeling the threads of connection pull tight in her chest. She reached out, brushing a shimmering ribbon of energy that flowed from the rift. It pulsed on her fingertips like a heartbeat. "It's alive," she murmured. "It's responding to us." The fisherman gritted his teeth. "Then we have to be smart. We can't just charge in. These warriors, these heroes, they're not enemies, but we can't assume we understand them yet." Suddenly, the knight in blackened armor raised her sword, not in attack, but in warning. Behind her, the other figures mirrored the motion, a silent chorus of readiness, not hostility. They had faced unimaginable trials in their own worlds, and yet here, the convergence demanded they cooperate, or face total collapse. The scholar noticed something strange, faint lines of energy, threads of possibility, extending from each figure, weaving around the traveler's own threads. Every decision, every movement tugged at these lines, causing ripples in the rift that made the mountains bend, rivers twist, and forests sway unnaturally. It was as if the plateau itself were a canvas, and their actions were painting a reality that did not yet exist. "We have to step carefully," the scholar said. "Each of us is part of the equation. One wrong move, one hesitation could unravel not only our world, but theirs." The healer nodded, eyes scanning the rift. "Then we need to coordinate, align our intentions with theirs. Our strength is not just in battle. It's an understanding in connection." The fisherman adjusted his stance, gripping his staff as the shadows from the rift began to press forward again. Then we show them who we are, but we move as one, or nothing survives. The travelers advanced, and, for the first time, the two groups began to converge. As they neared each other, the wind from the rift carried whispers, fragments of memories, lost battles, warnings from past choices. The scholar realized that the voices weren't threats. They were guides, fragments of other lives offering insight, urging caution, signaling opportunity. The knight in blackened armor finally spoke, her voice rough but commanding. "I am Lasura," she said, "and you are the threads I was warned about. If we fail here, all that we've fought for will be lost." The scholar swallowed. "We are travelers," she replied, "drawn here by forces we barely understand. But if our fates are intertwined, then we have no choice but to act together." The plateau itself seemed to acknowledge the alliance. The mist parted, revealing a path that connected both sides of the rift, shimmering with possibility. At the center of this fragile bridge hovered a crystalline prism, glowing with the combined energy of all the lives converging here. "That prism," the cloaked figure murmured, "holds the keystone of the convergence. Reach it, and you will shape the story itself. Fail, and all will collapse into shadow." The travelers glanced at each other. No words were necessary. Their resolve was clear. Together, with Lasara and her companions, they would step into the unknown, merging their story with the other, confronting dangers beyond imagination, and discovering that the true trial was not just survival, but mastering the weaving of destiny itself. With a deep breath, they began their march toward the prism, the rift roaring around them as shadows surged, threads tangled, and worlds collided. Each step forward was no longer just a journey. It was a statement that courage, unity, and choice could alter the very fabric of existence. The travelers in Lasara's group reached the shimmering bridge that spanned the rift. The crystalline prism floated at its center, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed almost alive, reflecting the combined energy of every life now tethered to this place. Yet before anyone could approach it, the shadows erupted. They weren't ordinary shadows. They were twisted echoes, forms of warriors, beasts, and specters from both worlds, distorted by the rift, their movements jerky, unnatural. Every shadow carried a fragment of memory, a regret, a rage, or a fear. As they attacked, each strike against them sent ripples of pain and hesitation through the travelers' minds. Lasara drew her sword, the blackened steel gleaming with an inner fire. "Hold the line. Protect the prism," she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. Beside her, a bow-wielding archer loosed arrows that arced like lightning, each striking a shadow with explosive bursts of light. The scholar stayed behind the front line, holding her staff, tracing intricate sigils in the air. Each sigil bound shadows temporarily, slowing their advance. Her hands trembled. The threads of the rift responded to her every thought, but controlling them was like trying to hold water in cupped hands. One misstep, and the shadows could overwhelm them. The healer darted among the wounded, weaving light around their bodies. Each pulse of her magic reinforced their strength, knitting flesh, bolstering resolve. "We can't stop now," she whispered, even as a shadow lunged at her from the mist. With a flick of her hands, a shield of radiant energy erupted, throwing the shadow back into the void. The fisherman swung his staff, carving paths through the shadows, each strike echoing with the rhythm of the rift. "We move together," he roared. "One step, one strike, united." His words carried across the chaos, reaching the travelers from the other story, synchronizing their attacks without a single shared language. The shadows grew more cunning. Some split into smaller fragments. Others merged into larger monstrosities that towered over the combatants. The rift pulsed violently with each clash, threatening to collapse the bridge entirely. The crystalline prism quivered, almost as if it were responding to their struggle, its glow dimming with every faltering defense. Lasara slashed through a massive shadow, and as her sword cut, the prism pulsed brighter. The scholar noticed the pattern. The closer they moved as a unified force, the more the prism strengthened. "We're feeding it with coordination," she shouted. "We fight as one, and we stabilize it." The healer nodded, summoning a torrent of light that cascaded across the bridge, forcing shadows to recoil. "We need to push the back now," she called, "or we lose the chance to even touch the prism." Together, the travelers and Lysara's warriors formed a tight formation. Blades flashed, spells erupted, and arrows streaked across the rift. With each coordinated strike, the shadows screamed and dissolved into fragments of smoke and mist, their cries echoing as if mourning the lives they once held. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last massive shadow shrieked and dissipated into nothingness. The bridge fell silent, save for the rhythmic pulse of the prism, which now glowed brighter than ever. Exhausted, battered, and covered in bruises, the two groups stared at the prism. Lysara's chest heaved as she lowered her sword. "We did it for now." She turned to the scholar. "But this is only the beginning. That prism, it's more than a keystone. It's a gateway, a test. We need to reach it, but we also need to survive what comes next. The rift will not yield its secrets easily." The scholar stepped forward cautiously, tracing a path through the shimmering energy toward the prism. The threads of the rift wrapped around her like living vines, guiding her, tugging at her mind. Each step was a choice, each breath a decision that could either solidify their convergence or tear their realities apart. As her fingers brushed the prism, a shockwave rippled through the bridge. The travelers felt visions flash before them. Past regrets, future possibilities, and memories not their own. Every choice they had made in both stories, the battles, the losses, the friendships, suddenly mattered on a scale they had never imagined. The prism pulsed one final time, brighter than the sun, and then began to fracture, slowly splitting into multiple shards. Each shard contained a fragment of a story, a path, a destiny. One shard hovered nearest to the scholar, glowing invitingly. "Choose wisely," Lysara said, her voice trembling slightly. "The shard you take will determine which story continues and which ends." The travelers exchanged glances. The weight of choice pressed down on them, heavier than any shadow they had faced. They had fought together, but now they had to decide whose story would lead and whose would bend. One wrong move could collapse everything into oblivion. The scholar's hand hovered over the shard, its surface rippling like liquid glass. Each pulse of light from it seemed to resonate with her heartbeat, matching her fear, her determination, her curiosity. Around her, Lysara's warriors stood tensely, their weapons ready, eyes darting between the prism fragments and the rift, which now writhed like a living creature. Sensing the weight of their decision, one of the travelers, a warrior from the other story, stepped forward, voice steady despite the tension. "We've come too far to hesitate. Whatever shard you touch, we follow it. Together." The scholar nodded, swallowing hard. "Then we choose," she whispered, and her fingers grazed the shard. Instantly, a torrent of energy erupted, lifting everyone off their feet. The bridge quaked violently as the shard's glow intensified, sending streams of color and memory across the rift. The travelers felt themselves pulled into visions, flashes of lives not entirely their own, yet intimately familiar. Battles lost, loves cherished, betrayals endured. When their feet touched the ground again, the world around them had shifted. The bridge had disappeared, replaced by a jagged landscape of fused realities. Forests intertwined with city ruins, rivers that flowed upward into skies streaked with auroras. The two stories had begun merging in a chaotic, beautiful, terrifying symphony of existence. Lysara's eyes widened. "It's happening. The worlds are converging. But it's unstable. We can't linger here, or the rift will tear us apart." Shadows began to reform, but now they were different. Not mindless echoes, but fragments of the two worlds' histories. Warriors who had survived, beasts that had roamed in legend, figures from both sides that should never have met. They were disoriented, confused, and dangerous. The scholar tried to step forward, her staff trembling in her hands. The shard, it's teaching us something. It's showing that our choices, every battle, every alliance, affects not just our story, but theirs too. This convergence, it's a test of balance. Suddenly, a massive figure emerged from the merged shadows, a being taller than any of them, cloaked in darkness, with eyes like burning coals. It was a hybrid of the greatest threats from both stories, a culmination of rage, vengeance, and chaos. The travelers froze, realizing the true consequence of touching the shard. The rift wasn't just merging their worlds, it was forging their enemies into something new, more powerful, and far more intelligent. Lysara gritted her teeth, raising her sword. Then we fight together, no matter which story we came from, no matter whose shard it was. The battle erupted immediately. Magic and steel clashed with terrifying force. Arrows streaked across skies now filled with floating debris. Fire erupted from the ground, and twisted creatures attacked from every angle. The travelers from both stories coordinated instinctively, their previous experiences blending into seamless teamwork. The scholar focused on the shard in her hands, tracing sigils into the air to stabilize the chaotic fusion of worlds. Each symbol drew back fragments of the rift, creating temporary safe zones where they could fight without being swallowed. But the more they tried to stabilize, the more volatile the environment became. The shard demanded sacrifices, choices, and courage. As the hybrid enemy approached, a warrior from the other story shouted, "It's feeding off our fear and indecision. We have to commit, or it will consume everything." Lysara met his gaze. "Then we make the impossible choice. Together." She charged, screaming, her sword igniting with energy drawn from both worlds. The hybrid being roared, its form shifting violently, almost splitting into separate entities, fragments of all the dangers they had faced before, now one unstoppable force. The scholar raised a shard high, chanting in a voice that carried across both stories. Light erupted, and the hybrid's form faltered, disintegrating into thousands of fragments. But instead of disappearing, the fragments fused into multiple smaller portals, each showing glimpses of alternate outcomes. Victories, defeats, betrayals, sacrifices. Everyone froze, realizing that the battle was over, but the story, the merged reality, was far from settled. They had survived the first convergence, but the shard had only begun revealing the infinite possibilities. The scholar turned to the group, her voice heavy but resolute. "This shard, it will guide us to the next step, but we must decide. Do we use it to shape the worlds deliberately, or let fate take its course? Every choice now will echo across both realities. There's no going back." Lysara's sword glowed faintly as she looked at the travelers. "Then we decide, together." Above them, the sky rippled, auroras dancing like living veins. The convergence had begun, and the next chapter, the true merging of stories, was waiting. The air was thick with tension, electric and almost sentient. The merged world stretched endlessly, a chaotic tapestry of forests spilling into city ruins, rivers carving impossible paths through skies streaked with auroras. Every footstep the travelers took seemed to echo across realities, each choice imprinting itself on the fragile fabric of the convergence. The scholar held the shard high, its light pulsing in sync with her heartbeat. She could feel the worlds trembling, waiting for a decision that would determine which threads would survive and which would be erased forever. Around her, Lysara and the other warriors stood ready, but their eyes betrayed the unspoken question, what must we give up to save everything? Then the hybrid fragments were formed, smaller now, but more cunning, whispering promises and threats that pierced the mind. "You cannot save both, you must choose," they hissed, voices like cracking glass. Shadows danced across the walls of reality, tempting them, testing their resolve. The scholar's hand shook, but she forced herself to speak. We have to unify our intentions. The shard doesn't just reflect the past. It responds to our hearts, our choices. If we act as one, maybe we survive." Lysara finished, her sword glowing brighter, energy drawn from both worlds. Or maybe we fail, but at least we try together. Each traveler stepped forward, placing a hand over the shard. They closed their eyes, letting their memories, regrets, and hopes mingle in a single stream. They felt the pain of losses, the joy of victories, the weight of every decision they had ever made. And slowly, the shard absorbed these emotions, turning the chaos into order. Not a perfect world, but a world where balance could exist. A brilliant explosion of light erupted. The auroras above twisted into a vortex, drawing the hybrid fragments toward it. Screams echoed, then faded, until silence descended. When the light dimmed, the travelers opened their eyes. The convergence had stabilized, but it was not as before. Cities still lay atop forests, but life had begun to adapt. Rivers flowed in gravity-defying arcs, and creatures from both worlds moved cautiously but peacefully. The travelers could feel the worlds breathing together, no longer in opposition but in fragile harmony. Lysara lowered her sword, looking at the scholar with awe. "We did it. Somehow, we made it work." The scholar nodded, exhausted but resolute. "The shard has chosen to trust us, but it will never stop testing us. Our duty isn't over. We must guide these worlds, help them adapt, or the balance will falter again." From the shadows, fragments that had once been enemies now wandered, confused but no longer hostile. The travelers realized that even the most dangerous threats could find a place if given time and guidance. It was a lesson they would carry forever. Power and fear were transient, but choice, collective choice, was enduring as dawn broke across the fused landscapes. The group gazed at horizons that spanned multiple realities. For the first time, hope was not a fragile illusion, but a tangible force, one they could nurture together. The scholar lowered the shard, now dim, but still radiating a soft warmth. "We survived the convergence, and now we shape what comes next." Lysara stepped forward, placing a hand on the scholar's shoulder. "Then let's do it, together." Above them, the skies shimmered with infinite possibilities. The stories had merged, the battles fought, the choices made. And now, the new world awaited its heroes. The shard rested quietly, a reminder that even in chaos, unity, courage, and choice could create order. And for the first time, every traveler felt it. Their stories were no longer separate, their destinies intertwined. The final chapter had closed, but the new story had only just begun.